Dr. Yvonne Burkart, we are so excited to have you on today. Our favorite toxicologist. We are going to be talking all about swaps and why they're important. So what we're talking about is all of our favorite products, which can be high in toxins, and how we can, still enjoy those products, but choose low tox options. And now for people who are listening, let's talk about why this is important, because I think some people will feel like, it's just a little bit of makeup, it's just a little bit of plastic here and there, but actually all this can add up. So can you talk about why these swaps can actually be very meaningful?
Yes, absolutely. Because as females, most of us or some of us will tend to use several products before we leave the house, just in our morning routine. Maybe you think about your oral care products, your toothpaste, maybe you're using mouthwash, face wash, lotion, maybe an SPF, deodorant. If you've taken a shower, then it's also shampoo, conditioner, body wash. So you can start to see how many products we're using just in our morning routine before we've even had breakfast most of the time. And what happens is that these little exposures, seemingly little, are not isolated. So it's not just that one product or two products that have some ingredients of concern. It's really all around us. And that's not to sound negative or scary. That's not it at all, because in the environment are chemicals. We can't escape them. But what we can do is choose better options so that we are not stimulating our bodies in a negative way. Because what's happening is that some of these ingredients are actually triggering at very low levels our hormones, which can impact our entire body. So it's, even though it seems like, oh, it's just a little bit of lipstick, a little bit of perfume, if you think about your hormones over a long period of time, especially as younger girls who are starting out with makeup, they can really get triggered into an area of dysregulation, so abnormality. And so that's part of why we're seeing so many rises in diseases.
It's crazy. You're so right. Just thinking about women before we even have breakfast, all the steps, all the products we use, that everything has fragrance these days. But let's start with one topic that's very near to my heart, makeup. You'll be looking at me. I need my lipstick. I need my eyeliner, my foundation. I am that girl. But let's talk about, maybe what are some of the biggest red flags when it comes to makeup and your suggestions on swaps that we should prioritize. I know that's a big question because there's so much that we can tackle in makeup, but would love to just kind of get your thoughts around that.
So the biggest umbrella, and I really like this question, by the way, the biggest umbrella, I guess, group of chemicals that we should be looking out for are endocrine disruptors. So our endocrine system is what releases hormones in our bodies, right? And I'm sure the listeners are aware of this, but just a quick recap, our hormones regulate everything from sleep, wake, appetite, metabolism, cognition, our reproductive, fertility, so many different things that when we're exposed to these endocrine disruptors, it can really throw a wrench in everything. And so what happens is you're just stimulating our endocrine system where it doesn't need to be stimulated. So it becomes dysregulated, it becomes disrupted, hence the name endocrine disruptors. So that would be the largest group and the main types of chemicals to target first if you're looking to clean up your routine.
And when you're saying endocrine disruptors, for someone who's like, okay, I've heard that word, but what should I look out in my makeup? Are there a few ingredients we should identify, whether it's in the foundation or lipstick, that you're like, these are red flags, just stay really far from them?
Yes. So the first one is actually something that you've already mentioned, right? Which is fragrances. Fragrances are in everything. You can go in any store, pick up a product, check the ingredients list. You will see the word fragrance or parfum on the back. That's a huge red flag because fragrance manufacturers are knowingly adding phthalates, which are endocrine disrupting chemicals, to these fragrances, but not having to disclose them because they get proprietary protection. So if you see the word fragrance, be very wary. If you choose to use a product that has fragrance, make sure that it specifically says phthalate free. That doesn't necessarily exonerate it and make it necessarily a healthy ingredient, but at least you're not being exposed to phthalates in that product. So that's at least one level of assurance. This is a very interesting one. It's very tricky because it doesn't show up on the ingredients list, but there are other indications that these chemicals could be in there. The chemicals I'm referring to are called PFAS chemicals, and those are chemicals that create a waterproof and long-lasting effect. And it's unfortunately and kind of weird, it's the same type of chemical that's used in nonstick cookware. So if you think about it, nonstick cookware is resistant to grease, it's resistant to a lot of different things, and so is waterproof ingredients in certain products, like you said, mascara, that's very common, foundation, as well as longwear lipstick. So I remember when longwear lipstick came out and it was all the rage, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You don't even have to reapply it. But then come to find out, how does it get this effect? It's these toxic PFAS chemicals, but they're not on the ingredients list, which is crazy. So one way of avoiding these chemicals is by avoiding waterproof and long-lasting products.
Good to know.
Yeah, very good to know. But I am curious about the mascara component, because I think lipstick women can get by, you can reapply, but waterproof mascara seems to be like you're at a wedding, you kind of want that feeling. Have you come across anything that is more waterproof or long standing in terms of makeup? Like, what are your favorite brands? And is there such thing as a safe waterproof mascara?
Well, I haven't personally tried anything that's marketed as waterproof, just simply because there's just so many unknowns. And if I'm shopping at a store, for example, or even online, trying to get as much information on what's exactly in that product isn't always the easiest, because some brands may or may not even respond if I ask questions. So we're kind of sometimes, if that's the case, then I won't buy from that brand. But the brands that are really transparent are really forthcoming. They'll share, they're proud of their ingredients. They work hard to create these products that work. So they will be happy to answer your questions. And those are the types of products that I personally use. But I have not really had a problem since switching away from waterproof mascara. Maybe, I'm a crier too. So
Yeah, me too.
I don't really have any complaints, to be honest. And, yeah, I think instead of waterproof mascara, something that has worked for me is just making sure I have tissues nearby and just, dabbing the little corners of my eyes, so I'm not crying or something like that. Or, not putting on makeup if I go to the gym, or if I'm going swimming, or anything where I'm expecting to sweat or be exposed to water, where you might think waterproof is really helpful. I think it's more of just a mindset switch for me. That's really what did it, because I was definitely into the waterproof mascara.
Good to know. And I remember in our other interview we had you on, and I'm so excited we have you back on. You had mentioned that, like, yes, there's so much for us to think about when it comes to makeup, but your lips might be one of the top priority. And I don't know, maybe you can kind of talk about that, because I never knew, lipstick and how we can ingest it was such a important thing.
Yeah, so that's a really good question too, because another question that often comes up is, which products do I switch first? Well, if you were to, let's say, be an avid lipstick user, lip gloss user, just be aware that there have been studies showing that lip gloss and lip products in particular happen to have potential for heavy metal contamination, because of the pigments, especially bright colored pigments like red, can have lead or mercury in them. And then also the long-lasting, long-wear effect can also come into play there. So with the lip products, like you said, you're applying it to your mouth. If you happen to drink water or eat something, then some of that is getting incidentally ingested. And even just during the process of, I don't know, going about your day, there's some migration into your mouth. So it's not that it's just sitting on your lips. You're actually ingesting some of it. And there have been estimates on how much a woman could ingest over time throughout a lifetime, and it could be up to a few pounds of lip products. So just think of it like what you're putting on your mouth, you're eating it to some extent. And it might be not like you're not taking a bite of the lipstick, of course, but there's some migration in there. And so if you're reapplying several times a day, if you are using lipstick every single day, this is something to be aware of, especially. And so a tip that I have is, of course, check for organic ingredients as much as possible, because if you are health conscious, you're likely also eating organic foods. So why not try to get organic lipstick if you can? And if you can't, then wipe it off before you eat and drink. I know that seems annoying because, we're told you got to drink water all day. So it's a trade-off, right? It's a balance. So personally, I just have not really worn lip products that often in my life. Just on special occasions, or if, I want to look better or something like that, then I will. But day to day, I don't really find myself using lip products. That's just a personal choice. But if you do, wipe it off before you eat and drink. That's a good way of reducing your exposure.
And I feel like we have so many swaps to talk about. I can spend like an hour on makeup, but a question I have, what are your thoughts around EWG and Yucca apps? I know so many people, including myself, before I buy makeup, I'll go, or really anything, this could apply to any product, I'll go in there and take a look. What are your thoughts around those two databases?
Well, first, just an overall general statement about these apps. They are helpful. They're helpful in that if you're brand new, if you're just, hey, I just need something better than what I've got, a little bit safer, it isn't necessarily always going to be 100% as reliable as if you were to read the ingredients list and vet the product yourself. That's really the best way. But if you've got these apps, if you're new, you're trying to figure things out, go ahead, use them, scan them, and see which products come up, look at the red flags, but be aware that none of these apps are perfect. And unfortunately, some of them don't flag nearly as many ingredients as they should be, in my opinion. So I think they could be a lot more strict. I think it could be more transparent in terms of how they're coming up with these ingredient ratings and transparency, whether or not a product has been sponsored.
That's a good point. And for anybody who is not familiar, what Yasmin's talking about, there's the Yucca app where you can scan a barcode and it'll show you the ingredients and how safe it is for you. And then there's the Skin Deep guide from Environmental Working Group where you can look up your skincare product or your makeup product and it'll give you a kind of a scale from 1 to 10, how toxic it is and the different ingredients in there and how carcinogenic they are or whatnot. So it's cool to know that, but I didn't know that potentially some of these products could be sponsored by some of these folks, which is, definitely a conflict of interest.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying in those two apps in particular, but just in apps in general. That is a question that is, on my mind. So I'm curious to know because some of these have, in my opinion, clear red flags that aren't marked, but then somehow are really ranking high. So wondering how that works. Maybe it's their algorithm. Maybe they're not sponsored. I mean, hopefully they're not sponsored. And nonetheless, I think they could be a lot more strict. So it is in some ways very helpful, but in other ways could see room for improvement.
I want to talk about something that was quite controversial last year, which is the Stanley Cup, which everyone was super excited about. Every girl in high school, middle school, younger was carrying around their huge Stanley Cup. And then something came out about, is this product toxic? Let's talk about that. What are your thoughts around the Stanley Cup? If anybody's listening, should they swap it out?
So Stanley Cup overall, not a bad product in my opinion. Definitely better than using a plastic water bottle. So the pros are, of course, sustainable, reusable. It's not plastic necessarily, at least where your drinks are sitting. The cons that I see with the Stanley are, depending on your preferences, the price can be, prohibitive. Another issue is that it comes with a plastic straw. That's not something that I would put in contact with my drinks. And I saw on their website indication that there could be usage with a hot drink. And that's definitely not something I would recommend because of the plastic lid. So what my sort of mantra is, or my go-to, is to avoid having my foods and drinks in contact with plastic. Even if they're cold, it doesn't really matter because the concern there is the potential for leaching, right? And plus, plastic is not sustainable. Plastic is really the root of a lot of the evils right now that are happening in the world of, toxicology and toxicity. Plastics are at the root of them. So the more we can avoid buying new plastic, the better. Nonetheless, the issue with Stanley that I saw circulating online is that there's a little circle on the bottom. So the way that the cup is constructed, there is a dot on the bottom that is soldered to the metal, and there's a little bit of lead in that solder. So then people were doing these home lead swab tests saying, oh my gosh, Stanley has lead in it. But that's not the part that comes in contact with your drink. It's not ideal, of course, right? We don't want to expose ourselves to lead if we can help it. And, a Stanley Cup is something that is a choice, right? If we can choose a different option that doesn't have lead, that's better for us. But is it as dangerous as they say? For a child, it could be a problem if they're touching that part of the cup. So I wouldn't recommend those types of cups for children. But if you're not a child and you're not touching the bottom of the cup, I don't see it as being a huge cause for concern because we're not licking the bottom of the cup, right? Yes, we're putting it on different surfaces in our home. It's not ideal, but again, lead is naturally occurring in our environment. It's not something to be fearful of. Lead naturally occurs in the soil. It's in root vegetables, it's in plants. It's not something to be fearful of in that we have ways to avoid it, right? It's not like, oh my gosh, you're exposed to any amount of lead and you're going to die. We know that's not the case. That just simply isn't true. So I think using our discernment and really understanding what types of exposures are significant versus ones that are not significant is really the key here. And so in the case of the Stanley Cup, I think it's not significant for adults. For a child, it's not ideal. I wouldn't recommend using that type of cup. And if you're looking for a stainless steel container for your child, make sure to ask the brand if they have lead, if they're using lead in it. But again, it's a small amount at the bottom of the cup on the outside that doesn't touch the drink.
Good,
I'm
good
so
tip.
happy that you see that. That's great.
That was a very in-depth explanation, but
No,
I
love
think,
that.
yeah, I think people need to know because we have to understand what exposures actually matter and what don't.
100%. And the fact that we know you as somebody who is so on top of this, so careful. So like, if you're saying this, it's important for people to listen, especially because sometimes we major in the minors when we should be majoring in the majors, right? And so for you to say like, hey, this is not that big of a deal, but there are so many other things that are creeping into our lives that are a big deal that we're not paying attention to is huge. So I'm so glad that you gave that response for us.
But yes, you brought up something right now that you just said, like, don't major in the minors, right? Like these little tiny things. Like if you are drinking out of a Stanley cup, at least you're drinking water, at least you're getting hydrated, right? Let's think of it like that. Or if you're, afraid of a Stanley cup, but then you're eating Cheez-Its, like that doesn't really help. Like we have to be mindful and aware of what is actually moving the needle in our toxic load. And it's not the Stanley cup. It's the food we eat. It's the air we breathe. It's the water we drink. Let's not forget the bigger picture. So love that you said that because that's exactly how I think.
So maybe we can talk about what you mentioned because I think it's important to like underscore this, really to focus on what is going to really move the needle when it comes to your toxic load. So you mentioned a few: air, water. Maybe you can just kind of share how somebody should approach that in their home, since majority of the time we're breathing and drinking water in our home base.
So the first thing that we should address is the quality of the air in our homes, right? The quality of the air in our homes is a direct determining factor in our health, period, end of story. There are statistics worldwide, how many people are dying from indoor air pollution, right? There are statistics about this, and it's not a low number. So we should be aware of this because mechanistically, when you breathe something in, if it gets down into your airways, it's crossing into your bloodstream. It's also going to your brain, right? So depending on what it is, but let's just think about it like that, like a nanoparticle or a type of gas. They can quickly enter your bloodstream. So we got to be really careful with that. And there are so many studies showing that there are cognitive and behavioral issues in children who live in homes where the indoor air quality is poor. So if you have anyone around you that's a smoker, or maybe the previous people who lived in your home were smokers, that pollution remains in your home unless you remove it, right? So the key is to remove and avoid creating pollutants in your air. So number one would be open your windows. That's very simple. Don't wear shoes in the house. That's actually an interesting one, controversial, but there is scientific evidence behind it. If you don't wear shoes in the house, then your health is better, right? Because they track in fecal bacteria, pathogens, pollution from outside. We don't want it in the house. I think that goes without saying. And then also avoiding things like fragrances, like we mentioned. Those are indoor air pollutants. They are what they call emerging pollutants. They can be persistent. Because what happens is once you create these and liberate these chemicals, they attach to the dust in your home. And unless you're dusting all the time and getting rid of it, you're basically recirculating it and getting re-exposed over and over again. So it's kind of, it's a not a good situation once you start creating the pollutants, but you can clean it up. So that's the good thing, is that you can clean it up. And then second, like you were asking about water is absolutely critical, right? We cannot survive without water. So being sure that you filter your water is very important, because most municipal water sources, absolutely in the United States, even in Europe, have pollutants in them. So we need to be able to filter it, and any amount of filtration is better than none. So I don't want anyone listening to think that they don't have the top of the line filter and so therefore they're doomed. That's not the case. Any amount of filtration is better than none.
I want to ask you about a few things. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm just going to ask you about stuff that I care about.
I'm sure other people care about it too.
I'm sure they do, especially, if they're in this world, for sure. I don't remember if it was you or I can't, I believe that I heard it from you, but I can't remember. But I want to talk about like laundry and basically nanoplastics in our clothing, and how when we wash them, like it can kind of create air pollution, I believe, just by washing the synthetic clothing. Is that true? Can you talk about that? Is there anything that we can do to help with the amount of synthetic clothing? I have it. I'm trying to lower the amount of synthetic clothing in my house, but it's just a fact. Like, I have kids, they have clothes that are not always perfect. Is there anything we can do to help reduce the burden of synthetic clothing in our lives?
Well, like you said, so if you already have the synthetic clothing, I don't think the best thing is to replace everything, because it's just ending up in the environment and it's polluting the environment, which pollutes everything else, and it affects us indirectly then, right? But let's say your kids have polyester clothing. Well, what we can do is, and just to be aware that polyester, what happens in any synthetic fiber, really, it's plastic, right? At the end of the day, it's synthetic. It's made from petroleum sources. It's plastic, and it breaks off. So anytime you're walking, moving, there's friction, little tiny fragments are breaking off. Those are microplastics, and they can end up in the laundry, right? So when you wash them, because there's a lot of agitation that goes on, you're scrubbing them, whatever, then little bits break off. And so they have these mesh bags. I've not tried it myself personally, but they supposedly catch the microplastics in the laundry. So I have heard of them. I haven't tried them, but I think that could be an option, right? If that's something, if you're not able to replace your clothing. Another one is this might be unpopular, but don't wash your clothing as often. So I think that is another thing, is like, if your kid's wearing an outfit for one time only, and then you wash it right away, then you're just basically creating microplastic every single time. So, but like you said, with the synthetics, the better options, of course, would be organic cotton, linen, hemp. Lyocell is a sustainable type of material. Bamboo is another type. There's some issues with that, but it's still better than synthetic.
They're talking about clothing. I remember Kea once brought this up when we were chatting, our underwear. You don't even think about it. Like, I'm like, oh, let me switch my shirts and my leggings. And I'm like, oh shit, my underwear probably should be one of the main places to start. So can you also share why that is probably so important if you're going to do a swap, that being maybe one of the priorities?
Yeah, I would definitely start with underwear. So if you're let's say you've gotten a bunch of hand-me-downs for your kids, right? Which is often the case. We definitely get a lot of hand-me-downs. We can't control what types of materials they are, and we're thankful to receive them. However, one of the things that we should be aware of is our undergarments, because they're in contact with our reproductive organs, right? Especially if you've got, preteens, younger girls, if they have to start wearing bras, try to get those organic cotton as much as you can, because we don't want substances from the synthetics like BPA, which is an endocrine disrupting chemical that was found in polyester. We don't want that necessarily rubbing onto our, breast tissue, highly hormonally active. Also in, down there where we wear underwear, we don't want the rubbing and the friction that could, potentially lead to chemical absorption of these, undesirable endocrine disruptors. Especially, you're basically delivering them exactly where you don't want them to go. So if there were any swaps that you should make first, I would recommend going for undergarments, especially for kids.
Yeah, the brand we love, which is super affordable, is Pact. PACT. That one, they do a great job, and they have high quality stuff, and it's actually like pretty affordable, which I know can be an issue when you're making these swaps. It can feel expensive, so it's nice to identify like the more affordable options. Let's talk about coffee, which is one of my favorite things and one of the first things I do in the morning, but it can be a source of toxins. Can you talk about this? Because I don't think a lot of people know that coffee can actually be pretty toxic.
Yeah, so coffee in and of itself, so outside of any environmental chemicals, let's just talk about what's inherently in coffee when you roast it. So anytime you roast something, there is the creation of carcinogenic chemicals, right? Don't be afraid of that. It's just naturally occurring. When you cook food, if you brown things, it's just part of what's called the Maillard reaction. If anyone is a nerd and really wants to know, these chemicals can have carcinogenic effects in the body, right? Doesn't mean that you're going to get cancer from drinking coffee. It just means that if just to be aware that those are just naturally occurring when you roast something. Then let's talk about the environmental component of that. So with coffee, when it's grown, if it's not treated properly or processed properly, I should say, then there could be mold growing on coffee. And there have been so many studies showing that a significant amount of coffee from around the world has mold in it. So if you're going for coffee, look for a brand that tests for mold, look for organic so you can minimize pesticide exposure. And you also want to look for any brands that may have tested for some of these carcinogens because there are ways of roasting that can minimize carcinogens. But with some of the bigger brands of coffee, they have such a huge market share. When they buy coffee from around the world, they kind of have to, in order to make it taste consistent and taste the same batch after batch, what they end up doing is kind of roasting it to death, right? So you just get it's just a burnt taste, right? It can be. So that's another issue. And then there can be problems with, like twigs and other things getting into it. So I recommend buying whole bean coffee, organic, tested for mold. And also if they test for some of these carcinogens and they roast it in a way that doesn't create more than necessary, then that's good, right? Because if you're buying these mainstream name brand coffees, you're not getting any of this information from them because they have such huge market share. Like they don't care about people who are looking for like the healthiest type of coffee. They're like, just get people their coffee, and make it taste burnt so that it's the same over and over again. And the more burnt taste it is, more likely it is to have these carcinogenic chemicals.
And I'm curious, Yvonne, are you a coffee drinker and what brands do you like?
I am. I drink coffee every day and I like to drink Purity coffee.
Purity coffee.
Yeah.
Okay.
They do all the testing that I mentioned. That's something that stood out to me because I had not seen other coffee brands talk about things like acrylamide, which is a chemical that happens, during the roasting process and stuff like that. And so coming from the food industry, I was like, yeah, coffee has a decent amount of acrylamide. That's something to be aware of. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not drinking a gallon of it. I'm having a cup a day. So that's okay. But if I can find one that has less, that's, a benefit. And then I saw Purity, they were testing for acrylamide. I was like, wow, this is cool. I haven't seen that from like a consumer brand. So I really like that.
Anytime that we're introduced to a new product or we're looking for a low tox option, me and my brother just like Google it and then put your name to see if you've like said
Oh my
anything.
gosh, that's hilarious.
Or we email you and we say like, hey, what do you think about this thing? Do you have on your website just like an area where you talk about your favorite products and categories? If people are like wanting to know what your thoughts are on products or what your favorite products are, do you offer that?
We actually do product and ingredient label reviews inside of our program, the Low-Tox University, which teaches people how to completely detox the home in 60 days, right? And the goal is to go step by step through the most important swaps, not necessarily, uproot your entire life because most people are doing pretty good, right? They're doing pretty well and you don't have to swap everything out, but just so you know the fundamental basics of what's really, like you said, going to move the needle. Yes. And then there are times when if somebody's looking on my website and they don't have, and the product that they're looking for isn't there and they have a question, then they'll submit it to the product and ingredient label review process. And then we'll go over it and tell you, the pros and cons. And then basically rate it using our system, which is keep, swap, or dump, right? So keep meaning low risk, low tox, swap meaning medium risk, and dump is a high risk.
I want to talk about kids products because that's something that I'm in the thick of, especially when it comes to snacks for my daughter. She's kind of in a little bit of her picky phase. We're working on it, but I find that a lot of the options available for her are wrapped in plastic or they don't come in, the best kinds of materials. So how are you managing snacks in your home for your kids? Do you have any advice there? Because I don't want to be overbearing, and I know that when we're at parties or out or she's at school, I can't control things, but I want to do my best to reduce her toxic burden, especially because things like estrogen dominance run in my family, like some of these more hormonal concerns are there. So any advice there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm also in the thick of it. I've got an 8-year-old and a soon to be 6-year-old, and they are highly influenced by what their friends have at school. And so I usually pack their lunch when they go to school for the most part, and they may or may not choose to eat it, which is not in my control because school lunches are free. So they'll see their friends getting school lunch, or what they have, in the cafeteria might be more enticing than what I packed in their lunchbox. So that's okay. I can't control that. I can't force them to eat their lunchbox, but I do my best to pack like small tomatoes, berries, cucumber slices, bell peppers, try to give them as many fresh fruits and veggies as possible because I know that they're not getting that at school, if they're eating school lunch. So if they, let's say, are at a party or something like that, I let them enjoy with their friends. I don't restrict them because I find that definitely when I was restricted, it made me want it more. But when you normalize it and you say, yeah, that's available and that's there and you can have it, but just be aware that it's not the healthiest choice. And they'll, okay, they can decide, and then if they start feeling unwell, then I'll say, hey, maybe let's think about making healthier choices then, right? So you can feel better more often. You don't have to feel bad. So that's kind of how I navigate it. I don't restrict them on anything, even though I'm fully aware of the risks and the cons of so many of the products out there. I don't restrict them if they're at a friend's party because I don't want them to feel like they've been deprived. And I don't want them to want it more so that when they're away from me, that's all they're choosing is the bad stuff. I want them to be able to make these choices on their own. But like you said, a lot of things are wrapped in plastic. We can't really avoid that, right? So the way that you can avoid that really is, is offering the fresh whole food choices at home as much as you can. So I kind of say like, basically it's all about what's happening at home.
Yeah, totally. A lot of the products that I felt excited about that are technically more on the processed side, but they're not ultra processed, that were in my home previously. A lot of controversy was raised about them, whether they be cassava based or chickpea based, or some of these grain free foods or things like that. What are your thoughts about that whole situation that happened, where a lot of these products were tested and some of them, the healthier ones, actually came back higher in heavy metals? Is this actually something that we should be concerned about, or is it a little bit more nuanced than we think?
Well, I would say everything is nuanced. There's nothing that's black and white, especially when it comes to health and toxic chemicals. But when you're asking specifically, I know exactly what you're talking about because we also had these discussions a lot in the house because we did like eating those chips and we still do. We'll enjoy them from time to time, but just being aware that unprocessed whole cassava is a staple food for many cultures around the world. So cassava having lead in and of itself does not mean that it is unhealthy. Simply because cassava has other nutrients in there that can help to block the absorption of some of these heavy metals. So the presence of a metal or a chemical doesn't automatically equal toxicity. And I think that's something that is really important. Take it in context by context, on a context by context basis, right? What type of food is it? Is it a processed food? No. Okay, I'm not scared. That's it. Very simple. If it's something that's processed, let's say cassava flour is the first ingredient. Maybe take pause on that. What type of food is it? Is it a chip? If it's a chip, then that's already an issue, right? It's a chip. It's not healthy. Look at the type of food it is, look at the ingredients, and look at how much you're actually eating of it. So if you want to eat cassava chips, go ahead, have a couple. The better ones would be actual slices of cassava that are fried, right? Preferably in a less industrially processed oil, like maybe avocado or olive oil. That would be not a horrible choice. It's still a chip though. Remember, it's still a chip. It's not healthy. So I think oftentimes people lose sight of the fact that a certain food inherently isn't healthy anyway. So a lead in an unhealthy food doesn't really make a difference because it's already unhealthy. You shouldn't be eating a whole bag anyway, right? I think people lose sight of that. They start focusing in on one thing and one thing alone, and they're like a dog with a bone and they can't let it go. And they just kind of lose sight of the fact that it's an unhealthy food to begin with. Just don't eat it then. Really? Cut back. It's not, but for children, right? I understand that's a concern because they were selling cassava based like puffs, right? Little snacks for kids. And that can't be a problem because cassava flour is not the same as whole cassava. It's been processed and the water has been removed. Anytime you remove water from something, it concentrates everything else that's in there. So that's why they were testing so high, is because they're made out of processed cassava. If it was literally made out of like a whole cassava that they picked out of the ground and mashed it up and then somehow made it into a puff, then that's not much different than what you get from the ground. Right? The more you process, the more steps are involved, the more likely it is to have some sort of concern. I think that's the end of it all, right? Because like you said, ultra processed versus unprocessed, right? It's clearly different. But yes, with kids, be wary of frequent consumption of cassava puffs or stuff like that, because these are, first of all, not the healthiest snack for your kid, right? And this is not to make any moms feel bad. I'm a mom. I give my kid snack. Just try your best to give them the fresh stuff.
Yeah, and there's definitely a bit of a rough patch of like retraining their taste buds, but it's so worth it in the end. And I'm saying that from somebody who's like in the thick of refusing to eat some of those things. And I know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but it'll be worth it, I think, especially because I want to prevent all of the things that I had to deal with for my daughter. So I know it can be rough and I've gone through it too. So if you're listening, we're not saying it from a place of like, we're not dealing with it. We are dealing with it too.
I'm going to pivot a little bit. And this is a topic that I'm still so confused about: cookware. I can't tell you how many times me and Drew will be like, okay, this is clean, we'll get this brand. And then we're like, oh shit, it has this in it. And then we get a new brand. So tell us more about what are things that we need to be mindful of when it comes to cookware, and what do we all need to use?
So a few things. First things first, the simpler the better. So if you have any option between a coated versus an uncoated piece of cookware, go with the uncoated option. Simply because the coatings are where the problems lie, for the most part, right? Coatings can be things like Teflon, which is a type of PFAS chemical. So many health concerns with that, different types of cancers, thyroid disruption, infertility, so much more. Hormone disruption, right? Then you have these ceramic coatings, not necessarily demonizing them. The question for me is, what are they made out of? Nobody can tell me what they're made out of. They're all proprietary. It's a big question mark, right? It's a black box. And so when we practice the precautionary principle, which is what I believe in the absence of data, we cannot say that something is safe. So avoid it until you have more information, right? Guilty until proven innocent. That's how what I believe in, right? So if you can, go for an uncoated piece of cookware. Ideally would be things like stainless steel, cast iron, or ceramic or glass, right? So, and when I say ceramic, I mean the whole thing is ceramic. It's not coated in ceramic, right? Again, I'm not demonizing them. It's just there are still questions that need to be answered before I can say, if it's, Low-Tox or not, if it's a concern or not. So that's very simple. But those 4 options, I would say, are the easiest options for most people to get. You can get stainless steel, cast iron. Both of those work on induction stoves. You can use glass if that's what you have. Just really depends on your preferences. And sometimes it'll take practice using these uncoated cookware pieces. And, it's not, like you said, there's a learning curve. Just do your best, and just really depends on how dedicated you are, right? If you really want something, if you really want to avoid toxic chemicals going into your food from these coated cookware pieces, then just dedicate yourself to learning how to use stainless steel or cast iron or whatever it is that you choose.
We love the brand that you recommend, Extrema, I think is their name, which we've started using recently, and stainless steel and all of that as well too. I want to talk about menstrual health products because a lot of women who listen to our podcast listen to us to talk about menstrual health. And I think last year there was some buzz in the media because a lot of tampons had been tested to be positive of lead and arsenic and cadmium. And, some things that seem gnarly for putting near our reproductive organs. So can you talk about the importance of our menstrual health products and some swaps we can use there?
Yes. So menstrual health products are really important because they're in direct contact with our reproductive organs, right? Hormonally sensitive, very active, a lot of blood flow down there. So be extremely careful. With that said, in regards to the heavy metals in tampons, just so you know, heavy metals have always been in tampons. It's just that they made headlines for whatever reason. Someone decided to publish the story and it became very mainstream. It's always been there. There's research papers dating years and years back, way before this whole controversy happened. There's always been heavy metals in there, but those aren't necessarily the worst chemicals that are in there, right? There have also been things like phthalates, right? Those endocrine disruptors. They're in scented products, bleach chemicals like dioxins. Those are carcinogens. Heavy metals aren't necessarily the worst chemicals that are in tampons. So I think, yes, we need to be aware of it. Yes, we want to avoid putting them down there. Do we know if they're actually getting absorbed or not is a question. It's not ideal. Let's try to avoid it as much as we can. There are some brands out there that have actually come up with testing to share with consumers after that article came out, which was helpful. And thankfully it was, one of the same brands that I had already been sharing as a better option, because this whole thing came up for me when I was shopping actually for period underwear. And there was a controversy that they were putting these Teflon-like chemicals in the crotch. And so that's when it came up for me. Okay, I really need to share this information with people because this is like you said, gnarly. This is terrible. It shouldn't be down there. It's awful. It's the worst thing, So just being aware, knowing that the better options would be organic cotton without an applicator. So again, I'm not dismissing it. It's definitely a problem. It's not something that is I think to the level that it was inflated in the media.
And what was a brand that you liked that you mentioned that they ended up doing the testing?
Naturacare.
Oh, Naturacare. Okay.
Naturacare, yeah. They make all kinds. I think they do pads, liners, tampons. So go for the applicator free. That's the plastic free option.
Got it. And you had mentioned the period underwear. I forgot about that entire controversy. So do you just avoid that now in general because of that situation?
Well, similar to the tampons, there's brands that do testing. So I've found a brand so I've tested several brands actually that did share testing. And only one out of the 3 that I tried actually stuck because there were, just personal preference. I like, the type of material, they're comfortable, they work better for me, so different factors like that. But you can find PFAS, tested period underwear. I mean, it's sad that we've come to the point where we have to test everything, but that's just the state of the world that we live in. And it's not, don't be afraid of it. Just know that there are better options and just do your best. Remember the fundamentals of what people always say, being healthy is, diet, lifestyle. It boils down to that really.
And hopefully this is just the great unraveling of we got to this point, we test, people are aware, and moving forward, brands will be more conscious and we'll just have so many better options and our future generations will have better options than we did, right? That's the goal. And I'm just so happy that people are aware of this because I feel 10, 15 years ago, if you talk about this kind of stuff, people look at you like you're crazy or you're being extra, but it's not extra. It's so true and it's so important. So Dr. Yvonne, thank you so much for going through these swaps with us. This is one of our favorite conversations to have where we're super into just low tox options. So thanks again.
Yeah, of course. It's been an absolute pleasure and I love sharing swaps. I'm always testing new products. So feel free to ask me if you have any questions about a product that you're looking at. I'm happy to help.
And we'll put all your information in our show notes so people can find you, follow you, sign up for everything you have on your website as well. But we love chatting with you, Yvonne. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.